get in and get out. And, the goal would be to certainly try to finish by 1 o'clock. So if we start at 11, we'll hopefully meet our goal. We may get out even before then. For you members, there is your food over here to my right, so come through and grab a sandwich if you would like a sandwich. It is over here, and we'll work and eat at the same time. I thought it would be prudent that we start off today's meeting, and we'll have a presentation from the group from Bellwether as our main presentation, but to talk about some basic assumptions that Chairman Garrett and I have discussed. We are in the informational component and trying to learn more about student-based funding, student-weighted funding. I would say that Chairman Garrett, being the very knowledgeable person that he is, I brought up in a meeting earlier, 43 states have some student-weighted formula, and the good chairman corrected me, said, I think we're up to about 45. That have used that type formula. So that means Alabama is in a shrinking minority of states that have a foundation type program based on headcount. But some of our assumptions that we have discussed are that we certainly want to align our funding with student needs. That's not what we're doing today, more or less. It's more on census or ADM as we know it. And then for members, how important it is at every school where you have students with disabilities or English language learners, those obviously cost more to deliver those services. And so that's the reason we want to look at the needs that each school has or school district has as far as its census or makeup of students, the type students that they have. We also want to try to see increased per pupil funding. If we do this right, we don't want to take money from one district and give it to another. That's a big concern of members, and I certainly would reflect that. We all represent districts. We also don't want to tamper with local funding. That is not something that we have in mind to do or go down that road as far as shifting local funds that is raised locally and spent locally and not sent to Montgomery. That's certainly not in our assumptions as we go down this road. We're also looking at more flexibility, of course, on how the funding is allocated at the local level rather than the more rigid foundation program that we have today.
Mr. Chairman, can I have a question, please?
Chairman Garrett.
Welcome all of our members here today. And so I think at the outset we said this is a good faith effort to try to understand what other states are doing to see if after 30 years of the current education funding model, if we need to take a different approach or modify what we do. We've communicated there's no decisions have been made. There's no preconceived ideas. We're gathering information. At the appropriate time, we're going to have a lot of people at the table if we decide to move forward on this. I see that Dr. Mackey is here, and perhaps we could save a lot of time if Dr. Mackey would just like to enlighten us. Perhaps you're misquoted, but what I read this morning was real disturbing, saying the extra funding the state would need to support a student-based model could come from a statewide tax increase of at least $2 billion, shifting money from school district with high levels of local funds to systems with fewer resources, or maintaining double digits of economic growth on an annual basis. Senator Orr just explained to you what the marching orders are for this commission as we look to study this issue. I'd like to give you the opportunity, if that's an accurate quote, to explain what maybe you're saying. Perhaps we need to disband the effort if that's the conclusion. And the other thing I want to make sure of is the way that you sabotage and disrupt efforts down here is with misinformation. And there have been numerous examples of times when the legislature has gotten involved to push the State Department to do certain things. The Numeracy Act is one thing, Literacy Act is another. I could go on and on and on. We're trying to work collaborative. You've been a part of these meetings. You were at the first meeting we had a year ago. I would like to understand why you said what you said, if that's where you think we truly are, and give you a chance to, because I think, as Senator Orr just said, we're not looking to shift money from any district to another district. And the idea that we would go into this with the idea of raising $2 billion statewide tax increase, I don't know where that's coming from.
Yes, sir. So I'll be glad to address that. So where the comments I think you're talking about, I was asked at a state board meeting about where we might be going and what had previously been done. The last study that the legislature undertook like this, many of you know, the Augenblick study, and then the prior study before that. So there was a study that was done in the late 80s that resulted in the current foundation program. There was another study that was done prior to my time as state superintendent. Both of those resulted in student-weighted formulas. The last one, it was about a $2 billion increase.
When was that?
It would take more money. That was in 2013, I think, 13, 14, in that era. So, and that study's still out there. And I said, as we go forward, looking at another study, I don't know what the result of that would be. Obviously, if we're really cautious, you're cautious about, you don't want to increase any funding, you don't want to shift any funding, those would be very different than the previous studies on student-weighted formulas that we've looked at. The reason those called for more money is because there was a question about adequacy. And so, as you probably know, in '95, when the foundation program we have, which a lot of folks wouldn't call, outside Alabama, would not call a true foundation program. It's kind of a semi-foundation program, because the proposal in '95 was true foundation program, the original proposal, which would have been basically student-weighted formula. But it was such a significant jump from the old minimum program, which had been passed, of course, in 1937, which came about. The old minimum program, which was also called a foundation program at the time, came about as a result of the state imposing an income tax to support public schools.
So do you support this effort to look at the situation where we are today?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yes, sir. And as you mentioned,
but do you understand that making comments like that are very disruptive to a good faith process? Do you understand that?
Well, I'm not trying to be disruptive to the process, so my apologies if it has been. And as you mentioned, you and Senator Orr and I and one of my staff members got to meet, I think, last December with the Bellwether folks. But they did talk about a significant amount of new revenue would be needed at the time if we did what they were proposing then. Now, I haven't had a meeting with them or seen any proposals since last January or last December, so that may have changed significantly.
Senator Orr articulated, I think, the ground rules going forward is that we're not looking at shifting money from one district to another. We're looking at local districts retaining the control of their funds. So there's some ground rules that that in our mind, take those ground rules, and then you determine if something's even possible.
Right.
Do you support that effort?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Anything else from me, sir? Or would you like for me to say anything else? Or or anybody else?
I just want to know that we're trying to look in good faith due diligence, and there's a lot of people that have to get involved. And my question is, can we count, or where do you stand on this? Are you going to be part of the group that wants to look at this, or have you already made up your mind that we need to just go home and stay as is?
No, sir. I think it would be great to look at it. Okay. Had a conversation separately with Chairman Orr back probably a month ago about looking at a proposal going forward. To be fair, I have seen nothing since the proposal that the two of you and I looked at last December. So I didn't know that things had changed and ground rules had changed, and I'm glad to see. But very, very much glad to be a part of the
And to be
discussion
clear,
going
I've
forward.
not seen anything either. Nor is anybody on this committee. We are in a process of gathering intelligence. We'll have a presentation today, and hopefully we'll learn more. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Mackey.
Thank you.
So thank you, Chairman Garrett. We do need the State Department's support if this body decides to go forward with some kind of legislation to address this. And again, folks, we're in the small minority now. It's down to 5 states. And the reason, Chairman Garrett, to remind you, and I believe that it was worthwhile for the budget committees to look at this, because we would be the 2 groups that would have the first look at any legislation that may be forthcoming. And I say may. We don't have a bill. I haven't even seen a draft of a bill. We are still in the discovery phase and learning phase of this process to learn what's out there, why are other states doing what they're doing, and would it help Alabama? Does it have a place in Alabama? Obviously, 45 other states think so, and it behooves us as chairman to bring that before you, show you the factors, show you the evidence, show you what's going on across state lines and across the country, and then present that to you. And then we, as a group, decide what course of action we'll take from there, if any. But our funding formula is antiquated, because the world is moving in a certain direction and has not sat still. We've been taking jabs and making efforts at things like literacy and numeracy, where we're focusing on different needs in our public schools across the state. And we think that, looking at the student needs and a student-based formula, that we can help our local school systems address particular populations that have particular needs, bringing more flexibility and to the process. But we are the ones that will decide how that gets done. And that's where, if we want to do anything, and doing nothing is an option if that's what this group wants to do, but at least we'll all be more educated and better educated as to what other states are doing. Today, we're going to hear from school funding experts, the Bellwether Group, who have helped other southern states design their student-weighted formulas, and they're different. Different states choose different pathways. There are a lot of different rabbit trails, if you will, that occur during the decision process. So they'll walk us through the types of choices that we would have to make if we decide to go down this road. So I appreciate your being here and your attendance, and it speaks volume to your interest and to the importance of the issue, because as the appropriators, that is our chief duty as legislators, and appreciate, again, your attendance. Chairman Garrett, any other words before we get rolling?
No, sir. Look forward to the presentations today.
All right. So I would ask whomever from the Bellwether Group that wants to come forward, introduce yourself to the committee, and we will get rolling.
All right. Thank you very much. Hi, I'm Jennifer Schiess. I am Senior Partner and Practice Lead for Policy and Evaluation at Bellwether. I'm joined today by my colleague, Alex Spurrier. He'll be coming up here to kind of take over the mic at certain points as well. Glad to be with you. There's us. I want to talk a little bit about Bellwether so you know who's standing in front of you before we kind of get into the meat of the content. We are a national nonprofit. We work exclusively in education, but early childhood through post-secondary. School finance work is a part of our work, but we work kind of across a wide range of policy issues. I myself am a state policy generalist. I worked for the Legislative Budget Office in the state of Texas for about a decade before I joined Bellwether, have been with Bellwether for about 10 years, and did school finance work in Texas as well, which is how I got interested in funding formulas. So I'm one of tens of people who really enjoy digging into these things. But our school finance initiative at Bellwether really focuses on a belief that while you cannot guarantee
Excuse me,
great...
could we ask the volume to be turned up a little bit on the microphones, please?
Okay.
Thank you.
Sorry. But a belief that while you cannot guarantee great outcomes with a great funding system, it's very difficult to get to great outcomes without a great funding system. And so that's why we do this work. We do this work kind of in 3 categories. We do a lot of research and analysis, which you can find published on our website. We provide data analysis trainings to help other folks use education finance data to test policy options and understand what's happening with their own school finance systems. And we do technical assistance work. We build models so that we can work with folks to test different policies, see what the outcomes are going to be, and see whether that aligns with their goals. For today, we're going to talk a little bit about what a student-weighted formula could look like for Alabama, understanding that you really have 2 decisions in front of you. One is whether you want to move forward with this work at all, so kind of that existential question of whether pursuing a student-weighted funding formula is the right choice for y'all. And then there are going to be about 1,000 design decisions after that if you decide to move forward with this. And we'll talk a little bit about both of those buckets, kind of what you might expect if you decide to go down this path, what you might hope to gain from a student-weighted funding formula, and a little bit about some of the design choices that'll be in front of you if you do take that path. So what we're really aiming for here is to talk a little bit about Alabama's current system, the foundation program, and some of the challenges that our analysis shows there. Essentially that the program is less generous compared to your peer states. It hasn't really kept pace with inflation in recent years and doesn't really sufficiently address student needs yet. We're going to talk a little bit about the research base about investment in education and an increasing research base that is showing that a higher level of investment does drive improved student outcomes. So we'll give you a little bit of that. We'll talk about how student-weighted funding formulas address some kind of core principles in school finance, adequacy, student needs, accountability, and transparency as a handful of things that we think that student-weighted funding formulas do a little bit better than other models. And then we'll give you some examples from other southern states on how these things can be designed, knowing that everything that we're bringing you today is really just a resource, not a recommendation, but information for you all to consider as you think about the choices before you. So I want to start by giving you a little bit of our perspective. We do have a perspective at Bellwether on what good looks like in a funding formula, and I want to be transparent about that with you all so that you kind of know where we're coming from in this. And we always recommend that when you're kind of starting a design process that you sort of think about these first principles. So we have 4 criteria that we assess finance systems on. One is adequacy, which has already been mentioned. Essentially, is there enough funding in the system to allow the state to meet its constitutional mandate? Secondly is, does the formula system focus on student need? Does it target funding towards student educational needs? And does it factor in local funding capacity in ways that use state resources efficiently? On responsibility, does it make clear where decision-making sits? Does it allow for local school districts, for example, to make decisions at the instructional level based on the specific needs of the students in their buildings? And then lastly, on transparency, are the policies as clear and understandable as they can be? I think we all know school finance formulas can be pretty complicated, pretty Byzantine, and hard to understand. Kind of the litmus test that we think about is it just as complicated as it needs to be to meet these other goals? With a goal being able to explain it to folks so that people understand how money is being allocated and where it's going. And then finally, does the reporting of revenue and expenditures create a feedback loop, especially for policymakers around student outcomes? Can you connect the money that's being allocated towards student needs with the outcomes that you're seeing for student groups who you're prioritizing in your policy? These are our principles. They don't need to be your principles. So I would encourage you kind of today as we're talking through and throughout the process of this commission's work to think about what your principles might be. One that often gets added here when we're working with groups and sort of developing their own principles is around accountability, which I think kind of ties to that last point around transparency and creating that feedback loop between how funding flows and the outcomes that you're seeing for students. But it's not one that we have elevated here, but often comes up in these conversations. So would just plant that. And we will talk a little bit about accountability and kind of how that has tied to policies in other states as they have made reforms to their finance systems. All right, and now we get into the fun stuff. So basically, there's three categories of types of student funding formulas. And some of what I'm going to say today, I think you may have heard a little bit about in your May meeting, but hopefully this will refresh you and your understanding of those things and not bore you. But I do want to reground us in some of these things. So the three categories of funding formulas, there's the student-weighted funding formula, where essentially school districts receive funding based on the students that they serve and the characteristics of those students that are tied to additional educational needs. There's a resource-based formula. That's what Alabama has currently, where school districts are receiving funding based primarily on inputs like teachers and supplies and all the inputs, the ingredients that go into education. And then the last and least common is program-based, where essentially it's functioning like a block grant, where a district might receive money for, here's $10 million for special education or $3 million for career and technical education. Nearly every system has elements of all three of these. So when we say it's a student-weighted funding formula or a resource-based formula, we're talking about what's driving the bulk of the money. But with program-based in particular, there's only one state, Wisconsin, which has an entirely program-based budget. All states have essentially moved away from that. But there are lots of pieces of state systems that retain that program basis. Transportation is one of them, where that often just makes sense to hold in a different bucket because the cost drivers for transportation are just different than they are for instructional needs, as you can imagine. So most states use a student-weighted funding formula. An increasing number. The last two school finance reforms in Tennessee and most recently in Mississippi have both transitioned resource-based formulas to student-weighted funding formulas, and we'll talk a little bit about those efforts later on today. So in terms of looking at, and these slides look much more colorful, maybe if you have a printed copy, you can kind of see our reds and greens there. But when we look at these three formula types against those four principles that I laid out, what we find is that a student-weighted funding formula really has the best shot of addressing all four principles. And it's not that you can't have a resource-based or a program-based formula that does meet these principles. It's just a lot harder to design one that does that and much, much harder to design one that can sustain that over time compared to a student-based formula. So in terms of adequacy, a student-weighted funding formula, and we're going to get a little bit into the structure of it a little bit later on, provides the legislature with some very straightforward mechanisms to match funding to student needs. So you have many fewer formula elements that you need to tinker with to kind of get that formula to keep pace with inflation and cost drivers and things like that that you're encountering down the line. In terms of student need, because it is entirely based on building a formula around student need, it does the best job of these three of really directly targeting students' educational needs. In terms of responsibility, which again is kind of where the locus of decision-making sits, it really is the most flexible in terms of giving local leaders the ability to make instructional decisions versus a mandate from the state that kind of treats all districts as a one-size-fits-all. And then in terms of transparency, because structurally it can often be the simplest, it's often the easiest to understand, the easiest to explain, the easiest for local leaders to be able to predict how much money they're going to get year to year based on the student enrollment that they are seeing in their districts, and also provides that clear connection to student needs. So it creates that feedback loop where you can really tie student outcomes to the funding that's going out the door, targeting the needs of those students. The other thing just to name is that in addition to determining how funding is allocated, state formulas often also determine who pays, so that local share piece. So typically you see an amount paid by the state, an amount paid from local revenue. Of course, you all know Alabama currently does this through the 10 mil requirement, so is already adjusting naturally the state revenue outlay per district based on the capacity of that district. Sort of whatever they can generate at 10 mils is their buy-in, their ante, if you will, and the state makes up the rest. So that is pretty typical for how states do that across the country. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about the current system, the Alabama Foundation Program, and then we'll dig more into what a student-weighted funding formula might look, how it might look differently. So we see challenges in all four of the principles for Alabama. In terms of adequacy, we'll talk about some data in just a second, But when we look at inflation adjusted per pupil revenues over time, Alabama hasn't kept pace, so districts have less buying power now than they had several years ago. And Alabama currently ranks 39th in the country for per pupil funding. Now rankings are rankings, and somebody's got to be first and somebody's got to be last. But Alabama's about $4,000 below the national average for student funding. In terms of student need, currently the state is providing minimal funding for students with disabilities, certainly much lower than many of its peer states. There's not really a strong correlation when we plot sort of funding that's going out to districts against student poverty. There's not a strong relationship there between those two things. And currently, English language learner funding isn't tied to individual student need, and we can talk a little bit about design choices there that can target that a little bit better, but you have a lot of options there as well. In terms of responsibility, the current system's pretty complicated and does kind of restrict what school districts can do and how many choices they have about using their instructional dollars. And only a small fraction of local revenue is accounted for in state policy currently. And then in terms of transparency, the foundation reports do include revenues, but how they're calculated is not totally clear. And there's not that clear mechanism of accountability that really shows the relationship between the funding that's going out the door and the student outcomes that you all are tracking. So I promised you some data. This is, and the headline is wrong, it should be 39th, not 41st. But when you look at per pupil funding, this, you can barely see the top, but this shows local, state, and federal, so total funding. This is where Alabama is 39th. I will note that these data are from fiscal year 22 because these are federal data in order to get the state comparison, and they always lag by several years. So this is before Tennessee implemented its new funding formula, and of course Mississippi just passed one, so I'm not sure how this may shake out in future years, but this is kind of where you all are sitting right underneath that call-out box there, about $4,000 below the national average. When we look at funding over time in raw dollars, state funding in Alabama has increased by more than $1,100 per pupil from 2007, 2008 until 2022. But when we adjust that for inflation, you're seeing a decline in per pupil funding from the state by $860 over that same period. And currently, Alabama is only providing a very small amount of differentiated funding, about 2.5% of its total funding for student learning needs. So what this shows you is kind of the major expenditure categories currently. The top three, foundation program, state and local, school nurses program, and technology coordinator, are the funding streams that are essentially going out uniformly. And then we've got below that, highlighted in green, I think, are funding formula pieces that are tied to either specific student needs or to specific programs. So we might equate those with the kinds of things you might consider weighting in the future. And what you can see now is that you've got about $5.3 billion in that sort of top box, which we might equate to sort of your general, this is what goes for every student. And then that differentiated funding that's based on need is $133 million, which is about 2.5%. That's pretty low compared to other states and kind of how other states differentiate funding based on different student groups. But when we start talking about structure, you might think about that top section as being what might make up a base amount of funding in a new funding formula, and you might think about weighting some of those things that are underneath, and we'll talk more about that structure when we get to it. So I talked a little bit about this feedback loop for accountability and understanding how funding is tied to student outcomes. So, as I mentioned, resource-based formulas like Alabama's really center funding conversations on inputs. And that, kind of specifies a particular mix of personnel choices, a particular mix of instructional choices that essentially is a template, a one-size-fits-all approach for all districts, and doesn't really enable districts to make choices based on their individual student populations. So there's a lot less flexibility there for local leaders to make choices. Across the country, there's kind of different sets of rules for these. Resource-based formulas don't always require that districts use money in particular ways, but they often imply it, and districts often take that implication. What student-weighted funding formulas really do for you in that case is allow those spending decisions to really happen at the local level. So the state is allocating based on student need, but is telling districts, okay, you know your students best, you make the decisions about how these dollars get allocated. And then student needs and student outcomes are often disconnected from one another in resource-based formulas and from spending decisions. And so that input focus and the complexity of those makes the conversations that you all need to have with your school districts about how the money is tied to outcomes very difficult. It's hard to draw that straight line. You get a much straighter line when you're in a student-weighted funding formula where you're allocating your dollars based on student need. Told you I'd talk to you a little bit about the research on whether money matters. It does. I don't think that comes as a surprise to anybody. It's kind of common sense. But we've got some good research backing showing this as well. We're seeing, very concrete outcomes tied to increases in dollars. Of course, how money is used matters. Both of those things can be true at the same time. But we are seeing increases in test scores, graduation rates, college-going rates that are tied to increases in school funding. Especially for low-income districts, we're seeing stronger outcomes with increases in funding for districts that serve high proportions of low-income students, and that we are seeing that those impacts accumulate over time. So as investments are increased and sustained, we're seeing decades of improvement. So that's all very encouraging and kind of does help make the argument that, yes, investing money in education does pay dividends down the line. When you look at, research on what the future of our workforce looks like. For example, Georgetown Center on Education and the Workforce just released its new projections that somewhere near 70% of jobs will require some kind of post-secondary credential. Doesn't have to be college, but they're going to need something in addition to high school. So, this enterprise, K-12, is preparing students for that next step, and they need to be ready for that. And we're seeing stronger outcomes tied to increased funding. So it's just something to think about as you think about sort of the future workforce needs of the state as well. And that's part of what this investment is buying. All right, we're going to start talking about formula structure a little bit here and kind of how student-weighted funding formulas work. I'm going to give you the highest level overview. Yeah.
Can I just to clarify in my mind, maybe help other people understand as well, just at a 200,000 foot level, the difference in the resource base and student. So let me say this and see if this is correct or correct me.
Yeah.
So the way we currently do it is we collect money in the foundation program. That money is allocated to the districts based upon a snapshot of head count. And the head count, I think, is 20 days after Labor Day, something like that. Okay, so every system would get their share of that. Now, within that, we also line item, like, for example, in building up the foundation, this amount is for transportation. This amount is for teacher salaries based upon X number of teachers, blah, blah, blah. That's what they get. We don't, built into that formula, I think, is a 5% assumption for special needs, something like that, special needs. That number actually statewide, I think, is more like 18%. So we're just giving a little bit earmark for that, but not that much. Well, that's not really earmarked. That's in the formula that we assume systems need. But then if we need to come along with ESL or whatnot, we then go to a line item and say, we'll provide, in addition to that, we'll give money for ESL. Now, I looked at a minute ago, and I think the statewide ESL allocation is like $16 million, which is not anything. I mean, when you try to split, and that's based on a grant situation. I kind of equate it, Senator Single, to this is in my mind with the math. Broadband, we set up a broadband authority. We didn't really have any revenue, but what we were doing was a $20 million broadband grant program, right? Well, now we had all the ARPA money, all the CARES Act, all that money came in, and we're going to spend a couple of $1 billion, which was the state decided to do that. And moving from 49th in broadband to 24th in broadband, as the governor is stating, would not have happened had we just continued to chip away to 20 million. So my point to that is that the way we're currently funding the ESL issue, we're putting very minimal dollars toward that. So what you would do now with a student-based funding model, you still have a program that calculates what the revenue that goes out to the systems is, but you're basically telling a system, here's the pot of money you've got, and when in the pot of money is based upon head count as one score, but other thing, if you have an inordinate amount of special needs, or if you have an inordinate amount of ESL or high poverty, that figures into your score. So your allocation is not just head count, it's a lot of other things. We're not earmarking separately, but you get that money, and then a system can choose to use it. They may decide they need additional teachers, or need additional career tech teacher, or may need more support personnel, but there's more discretion there. So the difference is right now, we're sort of centralized in determining how that money should be spent. This would basically give money allocated based upon the things we described, the needs of that system. But then even when they get the money, they would be able to use that more as they need it, as opposed to a mandate. Is that a fair way to say that?
Yeah, that was great. You don't need me.
Okay.
Yes, that was perfect. So I'm going to give you a very high-level overview of kind of how these systems are structured, and then Alex is going to walk you through some examples and food for thought for decisions you may need to make. I just want to reiterate, we're not making a recommendation here. We're giving you information, so don't take any of this as like there's a right way or a wrong way. A lot of decisions will need to be made down the line, but these are just some examples. So essentially, this is how a weighted student funding formula works. You have a base amount, which is a set amount that goes for every student. It's sort of the base amount is the amount that you assume every student, bottom line, with no additional needs, requires to support their education. That's the foundation of the program. And then you add to that weighted amounts that are tied to student characteristics. So we've just got a couple of examples up here. You might have an economic disadvantage weight for students who are low income. So for every student, you can see the little boxes there, who is low income, you get an additional plus up of funding on top of your base to meet the educational needs of that student, typically based on a percentage. We have an ELL weight here for English language learners, for example. We'll talk to you about, the various ones that different states include, but these are two very common ones. All that gets added together and you get your student weighted funding amount. So exactly as Representative Garrett explained. There's kinds of three sets of decisions to make when you're designing a student weighted funding formula. One is, what is that base amount? What are we basing it on? How are we making that decision? What is the cost that we want to attach to sort of that basic foundational level of education? The second is, what are our essential student weights? What do we want to prioritize in our weighting system? Typically, states at least have something for low income, something for students with disabilities, something for English language learners, but there's lots of other choices and things for y'all to consider as well, depending on what your policy priorities are and what you want to incentivize in your system. And then there may be other weights that you layer on top of that may be tied to specific programs or may be tied to community characteristics like concentrated poverty. We'll talk through some of those examples as well. But this is kind of the three categories of design decisions that would then be required if you decide to move forward with this. So I'm going to turn it to Alex and let him talk to you about some of the specifics and some examples from other states.
Thank you, Jen, and thank you all again for having us here today to talk a little bit about school finance reform. So I'm going to go through with you all kind of the individual components of the pyramid that Jen just showed. We're going to talk about what it looks like to set a base amount in a student-weighted funding formula, and then talk about some of the potential individual characteristics that you might want to weight for in a student-weighted funding formula, and then we'll finish up talking about other weights, weighting for community characteristics that might also be considered as part of a student-weighted funding formula for Alabama. So starting with the base amount, as Jen mentioned before, this is kind of the first big decision that you'll want to make as you're considering a student-weighted funding formula for Alabama. And there's different approaches you can take to determining what that might look like, not only just as a starting point, but then moving forward. So there's three different approaches. One is just to pick a simple uniform base, and this is the most common approach that states will use. They set a dollar amount for their base, and then they'll go and revise that amount over time as budget conditions change, needs students and communities in the state change over time. And it's also the most transparent. By having just a dollar amount for the base, it makes it really easy and straightforward for you all in the legislature to have a mechanism to adjust funding that would then flow throughout the rest of the formula. Because once you have weights that are attached to that base, as you increase that base amount, it also flows through the weights. So if your base goes from $5,000 to $5,200, and you've got a 25% weight attached for low-income students, that $200 increase in the base then gets translated through that 25% weight as well, without having to tinker with not only the low-income weight, but any other weights that you might have for different student needs. Outside of using just a simple uniform base amount, you can have a calculated consistent base. And so what this would mean is having a dollar amount that's calculated based on a series of predetermined inputs that would then inform what that base amount should be. And so this is probably most similar to what you all have right now in the foundation program, using that as a potential starting point. In the recent reform that Mississippi passed, they're going to have a starting base amount that they'll then revisit every 3 years to then understand, as conditions in the states have changed, how might we need to revise that base amount moving forward. And then the final approach, and certainly the most complex approach, would be to have a variable base that would change from district to district. This is the approach that Ohio currently takes, and it's very complex. There are literally dozens of elements that go into a formula that's embedded within a formula for them to come up with a different base amount for different districts. And so while there are certainly advantages to considering a variable base that may account for differences across communities, it also would add some complexity to a student-weighted funding formula. So 3 different approaches you can take to setting a base amount as you're considering a new formula for Alabama schools. Now, what you could consider is looking at some of the funding that you have available right now and using that as a starting point for conversation. As my colleague mentioned before, this is not a recommendation from us, but a suggestion as somewhere that you might have as a starting point for thinking about what a base might look like for Alabama in a student-weighted funding formula. So the $5.3 billion that Jen highlighted in an earlier slide, taking the foundation program, both the state and local amount combined, in addition to the school nurses program and the technology coordinator line item. Adding those together, you get the $5.3 billion. And if you were to divide that by the number of students across the state in FY24, that equates to about $7,283 per pupil. And so just to give a little bit of context for some of your neighboring states, in the formula Mississippi just passed, their base amount they're using is $6,695. And Tennessee's proposed base amount for FY25 coming up is $7,075. So that's the base. And once you've decided on the base, you can then turn and start thinking about what weights you might want to attach to that base for addressing particular student needs. And the most essential weights that universally every state that has a student-weighted funding formula include are weights for student poverty, weights for special education status, and weights for English learner status. So as mentioned before, the line items that kind of sit outside of that $5.3 billion in Alabama right now add up to just about 2.5% of the $5.3 billion that currently goes to fund Alabama schools, and that's about, again, $183 per pupil, a relatively low amount compared to other states that are waiting for particular student needs. So there's certainly potential for Alabama to improve how funding is flowing to address these particular student needs across districts in Alabama. So I already mentioned the first 3 groups that are included in almost every student-weighted funding formula across every state for poverty, special education, and English learner status. But there are other individual student weights that you all might consider. Some states have weights for individual grade levels. Those are particularly applied in states that have school districts that don't just serve K-12, but they might have some districts that are elementary only, some that are high school only, some that serve all ranges. So some formulas have weights to account for that. Some states add weights for students who are identified as gifted. But then there are also other weights you can consider to account for different characteristics of communities across your state. Not every district is a monolith in Alabama. Not every community is a monolith. They all have different needs. And so some formulas use adjustments or weights to account for rurality, which is a hard word to say. But the concept basically being is as districts get more and more sparse and you add more square miles but have the same number or smaller number of students, that introduces unique cost challenges to those districts. It's harder to run transportation services to cover a larger area. If you've got a kindergarten class that has 17 students, you still need a whole kindergarten teacher versus another district where you might have 20 students in a kindergarten class. Or if it goes down to 12 students the next year, you still need to have one teacher. So there are some diseconomies of scale that are associated with particularly rural districts. Cost of living in some states can vary significantly across the state and different regions of the state. Other states also weight for concentrated poverty. There's a decent amount of research that shows when students are growing up in communities with higher levels of poverty, it increases the learning challenges that exist within those schools. And so many states account for that by directing additional funding on top of an individual student poverty weight to account for communities that might have impacts from concentrations of poverty that are affecting students and learning in those communities. Some states also choose to add weights for charter schools. This is often because charter schools typically don't have access to local revenue that is generated in states, but that might be something that you would want to include in a formula for a student-weighted funding formula. And then there might be some other programmatic costs that might not warrant a weight and might make sense to keep outside of a student-weighted funding formula. We already talked about a couple of those, transportation being the big one. In some cases, CTE might be a program that is best addressed outside of a student-weighted funding formula if there are some unique cost structures that are not necessarily driven by headcount, but might be driven by particular equipment needs or other programmatic costs. And then facilities funding also typically sits outside of a student-weighted funding formula. So how might we start designing these individual weights? So starting with the weight for student poverty, many states use just a straight percentage weight. So they'll define this percentage in statute and use some measure of student poverty to then determine how many students within a school district would have that weight applied to them. So the most common way to do that is through free and reduced price lunch designations. Other states take different approaches. They might use what's called direct certification and use students that are already participating in other state programs, so SNAP, TANF, students who are identified as homeless or foster care students. Those are all different ways to serve as the proxy for student poverty that would then inform which students qualify for that particular weight. And as I mentioned before, some states that have relatively high concentrations of poverty in particular parts of the state choose to add a weight for concentrated poverty. And there's different approaches to doing this, but Alabama does have, I don't have to tell you all, relatively high child poverty rates. I believe 6th in the nation is what Alabama currently sits at in terms of poverty according to the US Census for children. So a concentrated poverty weight might be one that you all might consider as you move forward in a potential design process. Taking a look at some other southern states, there's a pretty wide range of weights and approaches to identifying low-income students for the purposes of a poverty weight. So Alabama currently has the at-risk funding stream, which in FY24 was about $22.5 million. So not a percentage weight, but other states in the South are using percentage weights to direct additional funding to students in poverty. So Arkansas has a range of weights all the way from 7.6% up to 23% based on the concentration of free and reduced price lunch students in each district. Kentucky, the state where I live, just has a straight 15% weight for students who are qualifying for free but not reduced lunch. And then, Louisiana, Mississippi, Tennessee, Texas, they all take different approaches. Some use direct certification and free and reduced price lunch. Some just use direct cert. Mississippi is going to be using direct cert with an escalating weight for districts that are over 35% students qualifying for those direct certification programs. So a lot of different design decisions that can be made to designing a weight for student poverty. But the big 3 points there are, one, how are you identifying which students qualify as being in poverty? 2, what percentage weight do you want to attach for those particular students? And then 3, do you want to include an escalating weight for districts that have higher concentrations of poverty than other districts? Special education is another really important weight in or a set of weights in most cases for developing a student-weighted funding system. So students that are eligible for special education services have certain legal rights, and there is federal funding to help support the needs of special education students, but it is by no means sufficient to meet the legal mandates and requirements that those students need to have. So when thinking about designing a special education weight or series of weights to meet special education needs, many states use a tiered system of weights that align different percentages to different types of special education, either identification or services provided to those particular students. Because as you all know, a student that qualifies for special education can have very different needs from another student that qualifies for special education. You might have one student that has some issues with dyslexia. You might have another student that is homebound or hospitalized and requires a much, much higher level of service, even though they both have just a special education identification. In addition to a set of weights that account for particular needs of students qualifying for special education, many states also have a high cost fund, particularly to support lower enrollment districts, to kind of serve as an insurance against having one or a handful of students that are particular low incidence, high cost special education needs. So many states include that as a supplement to a system of weights for special education students. And as mentioned before, the current foundation program in Alabama bumps up the ADM count by 5% to account for special education needs, while we know that the actual special education rates are closer to 18% across the state. So certainly some room to improve this, and the way this would work under a student-weighted funding formula with a tiered weight is kind of analogous to what we've got illustrated on this graphic here. So as you have students qualifying for special education with particular needs, you could have a series of tiered weights that align with the costs associated with those needs. So again, for students with more mild needs for their special education services, you might have a lower weight amount relative to students that have, blindness and deafness, hearing issues, or students who are homebound and hospitalized, having a series of escalating weights that are aligned with the services needed to support the education of those students. Now, again, states in the South take many different approaches to this. So in Alabama, as I mentioned, you've got the 5% plus up in the ADM counts to account for special education services and a high cost services fund as well. Other states have different approaches. Some have many tiers. Texas has 13 tiers for different levels of special education services. We've got that illustrated on this slide right here, what those designations are and what those weights translate to. Mississippi is going with 3 tiers in their newly designed formula. Kentucky, where I'm from, has 3 tiers. Louisiana has 1 weight plus a high cost tier. So a lot of different ways to approach this, but many approaches at trying to get at the same end goal, which is differentiating funding in a meaningful way to account for the needs that these students have so that their districts have the resources they need to support their education.
Quick question, can
Yeah.
do systems game the system in that they, as far as special ed or ELL, do they kind of make, put on the board more special needs students than maybe there are, or weight them heavily? Are they able to manipulate our English language learners that maybe speak better English than they're given credit for in the reporting? Or
Understand the concern, but I think particularly with special education, because there are so many legal rights and processes that come with having a special education designation once a student has an IEP, and there are federal requirements for maintenance of funding effort for special education services as well. So, Jen, I'm not sure if there's anything else you want to add on this point, but I'm not sure that there's been instances of districts trying to game the system to get more funding,
more dollars,
over identifying kids for special education services.
Yeah, I mean, what Alex said is right. There's not a strong incentive for districts to over-identify for special education because they're on the hook for providing those services regardless. And whatever is in the IEP is what the districts have to provide regardless of the cost. So if it costs more than they're getting through IDEA and the state, they're going to have to make up those dollars locally. English language learners also, because there are so many requirements tied to federal funding for English language learners, and it built into your state accountability system too. They're required to take English proficiency tests, and there are accountability mechanisms already in place around English language learners gaining English proficiency. I will admit that I don't know enough about your current state system to know whether the incentives are exactly lined up that way here. So it's certainly something to think about. But I would say, based on the services that are then required to be provided to students, I think it's hard to make a case that there's a strong incentive for districts to over-identify, at least in those two categories.
So turning to English learners, similar situation for special education, where there's broad consensus that English learners require costs beyond the base amount that might be directed towards students in a student-weighted funding system. And again, federal funding for English learners is often insufficient to provide an adequate level of those services. And English learners, including in Alabama, are a very fast-growing part of the student population, and they bring a particular set of needs that probably warrant some sort of additional weighting or funding in a student-weighted funding system. So similar to special education, many states use tiers to differentiate between English learners that have different levels of need. So when I was a teacher, I taught in a school that had predominantly English students who spoke English as a second language. And we had some students who grew up just speaking Spanish, but also spoke English conversationally. Those students required a different level of service than students that I got into my classroom who came from a country where they did not receive any type of formal education before coming to the United States. So within the category of English learners, there's a broad range of different needs that those students have. Many states choose to reflect that broad range of needs in their funding systems by having separate weights for different levels of English learner. So students, one approach to doing this is by kind of years of English learner designation. So you might consider in a situation where a student is in their first year of English learner services, having a weight that is higher to account for the needs of students who are just in the first year of an EL program, versus students who are in year 2 or more of EL services, having a reduced weight to kind of smooth out the differences between those particular EL student groups. Now, turning to other funding systems across the South, there are some states that just use a single weight for English learners. Other states are using different tiers. So both Tennessee and Texas have 3 tiers of English learners that they account for in their funding system. And in Alabama right now, it is a categorical grant. And I believe, as Rep. Garrett mentioned earlier, it's about $16.2 million right now. So those are some of the big individual student weights. Turning to weights that address particular community needs. Rural weights, or weighting for local capacity, is particularly important for a state like Alabama, where you do have many districts that serve very rural communities. I already mentioned some of the challenges that rural communities or sparsely populated districts might face. In addition to the ones I mentioned before, they can also face issues in teacher recruitment and retention, often because the institutions of higher education that are training and certifying teachers may not be located within very close proximity to rural districts. And there's a lot of research that shows teachers, when they graduate from a teacher preparation program, they tend to stay either in the districts where those teacher preparation programs were adjacent to, or they go back to their hometowns. So those are the 2 main drivers of where teachers go after college. And if those 2 spots aren't in a rural community, it's very hard for rural communities to attract and retain educators to their districts. And so there's a couple of ways to account for the needs of those communities in a student-weighted funding formula. You could have a flat weight that identifies, for districts that have below 25 students per square mile, we're going to give them an additional X% to account for the needs that those districts have. You could have a sliding scale weight that says, okay, For districts that are below 25 students per square mile, we're going to gradually increase a weight for those districts as the sparsity grows more intense to account for the different needs of a district that might have 24 students per square mile compared to a district that has 2 students per square mile because they have very different needs. Another consideration when thinking about sparsity weights or thinking about local capacity is charter schools. Since they do not have any capacity in most states to raise local revenue themselves, it can be appropriate to include them in a consideration for a local capacity weight. Now, turning to, again, our group of example states from across the South here, some states do not currently address sparsity or rural districts in their student funding system. Alabama and my state of Kentucky neither address that right now. Other states do. So Tennessee provides a 5% additional weight for districts that have fewer than 25 students per square mile. Mississippi has a escalating weight that starts at 1% for districts with fewer than 8 students per square mile that can go all the way up to an 8% weight for districts that are even more sparse than that. And then there's a whole range of different options available here, similar to other weights, different design choices that are trying to get at the unique needs of the school district communities across those states. And then turning to other programs that might be best supported outside of the formulas, we talked a little bit about transportation and career technical education. Those are two programs or offerings for school districts that the state supports that have very unique cost drivers in many instances that go beyond just headcount. Fuel prices, vehicle miles driven, those are all very important factors in funding transportation that don't necessarily make sense to include in a student-weighted funding formula that's going towards cost to operate schools. The same goes for CTE programs. Your state might have regional centers that are funded through different mechanisms or intra-district programs that not every district is offering that might warrant a different funding mechanism to support those programs. So some states choose to wait for those particular needs. Many don't. And so, again, those are options for you all to consider as you're designing your formula.
Guys, just a general question, piggybacking to Chairman Orr said a minute ago, think about the gaming the system or whatnot. When you look at the actual weighting, who determines that? Is that what are there's criteria? I'm assuming it's all driven by data, right?
Yeah, I mean,
So
it's
who actually makes that score, makes that determination that your weight is this versus this?
In terms of how students are identified for weights?
No,
mean-
yeah.
Well, you all can decide that. You can decide what the criteria are that trigger weights, and then typically there's, the Department of Education or somebody maintains a sort of this is how we're counting students, kind of a rule book for that defines what the data characteristics are that the state's collecting and how those payments are being
So I guess
allocated.
my question is, in these other states that already have this, is that a controversial aspect of this, or is it pretty cut and dry that once the rules are determined, the actual implementation is not an issue?
I mean, I think it's a conversation when the bill is new in the rulemaking process as sort of those details get defined, but it's not super controversial beyond that when the bill is being implemented, once sort of those rules of engagement are defined. And as I said, you kind of have choices in terms of how much detail you want to put into statute versus what you want to leave to rule, but that's where those conversations typically happen.
But typically, once you get past that initial stage, there's not a lot of issues with the score you receive and what's actually.
No, it's usually quite transparent. I mean, the rules are very clear what's being collected and what's being paid on. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Jen, I'll actually have you stay up here to talk about bringing this all together.
All right, so I will wrap us up here and we'll stop talking at you. So I want to talk about what these things kind of look like when we pull all of these elements together. What we're showing you here are the two most recent school finance reforms. These are kind of the basic structure of Tennessee's current system, which was implemented in the last couple of years, and then the system that Mississippi just passed in its last legislative session. And you can kind of see here the different elements that Alex discussed, their different base amounts, their weight for low income, special education, their approach to English learners. Mississippi includes a gifted weight, Tennessee doesn't. Mississippi includes a weight for CTE, Tennessee does not. So you can kind of see that there are a range of choices here, even between, two states that have, some similarities to one another. They've just made different design choices that meet their needs the best. So, there are a lot of decisions that you all have in front of you in terms of, the different options you have here, and there are lots of good options. I'll finish this up just by talking about a little bit about implementation and accountability. So one thing to bear in mind is that, shifting from a resource-based formula that is pretty prescriptive and, tells districts exactly how to set their budgets up to a system that's much more flexible does require some transition. And, absent that template, local districts may need some technical support, some assistance for really to understand how they can strategically leverage those dollars differently than in the current system. And the second piece to that is that accountability piece. And just want to talk a little bit about kind of what that's looked like in other states. I've said probably about 100 times today, you do get that through line between your student-weighted funding system and the outcomes for students that you're looking for. So you can have a better conversation about where your dollars are going and whether or not those dollars are being leveraged appropriately at the local level to drive the outcomes that you're wanting to see. Tennessee, for example, has set up kind of a hearing system through their State Board of Education tied to their bills called the TISA bill, Tennessee Investment for Student Achievement. And that's going through rulemaking now, so they haven't implemented it yet. But that process is intended to enable that kind of public conversation between these are the dollars that you got for these students, and what are you seeing in terms of outcomes for those student groups that we as the legislature have prioritized in our policy. That hearing system will kick off in another year or so, and they have an A to F accountability system where districts get a grade, A to F. So they're targeting the first year, I believe, districts that have schools that receive an F grade. So they're going to have a hearing and they're going to have a conversation in public about how the districts have used the dollars that they've received under the new funding formula that are tied to these students and the outcomes that they're seeing. And there are some consequences that are tied to that. The legislation allows for the state board to ask the department to conduct an audit, also allows them to direct a change to their school improvement plan. So there are some things you can set up that really do tie the accountability structures between the funding and the outcomes that you'd like to see. And I'll stop talking.
Thank you for that, Jen. Quick question related to that last point about accountability. Have you ever encountered a school system where they received increased funding because of the weights after a model and they spent the money on football stadiums or basketball gyms or swimming pools or something like that, and not academic achievement? That'd be athletic, but you don't see the outputs that you'd like to see because the money was spent on non-academic items.
I haven't seen every school district, but just thinking back to my time in Texas, there were pretty strict rules around sort of that, Friday Night Lights is real, and football is a big deal in Texas as it is here in Alabama, I hear. But I won't say which side I'm on of that argument, but I have some war eagles in my family. So, you can set those in rule or law and just say, this can be used for facilities or not. And, in Texas, they just said, we're not buying football stadiums with instructional dollars. So you can't build athletic facilities with your instructional money. You can do what you want with your bond issuance. And if your local voters will vote for a football stadium, then you can have a football stadium. And so you see some very fancy football stadiums in some Texas school districts, but not with their instructional dollars. And certainly you do see some fraud, and that's illegal, and that's dealt with.
Have you seen, you had a slide earlier with the academic improvement, and it was 1.9% or 2% or something in that range. And you said that's over time, you see it continue to march upward. so it's not flat. It continues to improve. Uh, i- that is attributable to the money, the increased money that's going into the school districts.
That's right. There's several different studies out there, and actually on the plane down here, I was reading. There's some new research out on the federal ESSER spending, the federal stimulus dollars, that is kind of replicating those effects for just the one-time ESSER funds and showing bumps in student achievement tied to that money as well. Now we would expect that to go away because that money is not sustained, but it does reinforce that idea that a little bit of additional funding can go a long way to drive improvements in student outcomes.
So what if you have a school district that you see a substantial funding increase, and the performance is flat to continue to decline? What's the intervention or remedy there, or has there been a state that has that in their statute or their rulemaking as far as accountability and demanding that the outputs improve if the dollars improve?
Yeah, I haven't seen a state that's kind of tied a specific outcome or accountability consequence. I wouldn't be surprised if we start to see more of that tied to federal accountability. I mean, you all have a state accountability system now that drives certain interventions and requirements for districts that are or schools that are underperforming. I think what we have seen a little bit of is some outcomes-based funding, so more of a carrot approach than a stick approach, where there's some money that's, Texas does this, Tennessee is doing it as well, that's tied to achieving certain outcomes for students. Typically, it's tied to, are you getting a certain test score? Are you seeing improved graduation rates for students who sort of meet those categories that we talked about that are already weighted? So students who are low income, students who are English language learners, students with disabilities. So really tied to that kind of improvement. But certainly, you have the purview to write, kind of whatever sticks and carrots you think are appropriate into your accountability structure, and can certainly tie it to your funding system. I think one thing, as I mentioned, in terms of transparency for student-weighted funding formulas, it does give you kind of that sort of clear, like, this is what the money's for. You've set a clear priority in your policy and a clear message about where you want folks to really focus their energy and time in terms of outcomes.
Thank you. Do we have questions, Representative?
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. I appreciate your presentation. I have a couple of questions. The states that have percentages for the various criteria that you stated, do they typically back into that percentage? Do they have an objective, like a dollar amount objective that they're looking towards, and then they come in and say, okay, the weighted amount for special needs tier 1 is 8% or 12%? Are they starting with a dollar amount and backing into a percentage?
Not usually. I mean, there's not a consistent research base that says this is the answer, because it's very context dependent. I mean, what it takes to drive an outcome in one place may be very radically different just based on what's happening on the ground. But I haven't really seen a case where they're starting with the dollars. They're typically starting with the percentage and then trying, the dollars obviously factor in. You have a budget that you have to meet and some constraints tied to that. So the dollars do come into it. But typically the design process starts with kind of what are those first principles? What are our goals and objectives? Might look to other states for examples for sort of where are these things typically set. Certainly there is some research to sort of point you to sort of some minimums, or what are some cost drivers that you can really anchor some of those weights to as you think about the relationship between the base and those weights and the amount of money that's driving. But it's generally a bottom-up design process, not a kind of top-down design process.
That leads to my next question. So I see the value in having those percentages, because it allows you to modify and adjust those levers as times change. So I would assume, and I wasn't here 15 years ago, but I would assume that 15 years ago, English as a second language was not dominating conversations in our state about education and funding. It is now, and I don't know what will be dominating our conversations 15 years from now. But if we continue to just add line items to our budget each year, the line items rarely ever go away. We usually just add a line item and then it just stays there forever. And if all we're doing is adding line items to our budget to meet the need of the day, instead of having a mechanism by which we can adjust that, increase or decrease as times change. Are there states that have had this implemented for a long enough time that they have made those adjustments?
I mean, a lot of states have had student-weighted funding systems for many, many years. I can speak to Texas. I worked there for 10 years and went through 2 school finance reform processes where, some of these weights were readjusted. Texas used to, for example, have a flat weight for English learners at 10% for every English language learner, and determined that that wasn't getting it done. So they created a tiered weight that looked at, the length of time that students had been in the country. As Alex kind of showed you, raised that weight for students who had less experience in U.S. schools and started to taper that down over time as students gained English proficiency. So certainly, I mean, I think you're hitting on something there, that because this system is a system, it's naturally going to adjust for demographics. And that happens at the state level. It also happens at the district level. So, if you're a district whose English language learner population is growing by leaps and bounds, a system like this is automatically going to adjust for that, because you're automatically going to get the funding for those additional students as they start to enroll in your school. So you see a lot more sort of natural adjustment over time with a system like this, and less sort of year-to-year legislative tinkering required. Not that you would never sort of go into it and reset and adjust, as you said, but it's a little bit more organic that way.
Representative Drummond.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I certainly appreciate it. My question is, and if you can talk about this a little bit from the other states that are doing this now, when you look at the student base or the weighted system as opposed to public and charter schools, when the accountability measures are different for both, how are other states dealing with policies as it relates to those two to make sure that the accountability and the transparency somewhat equal? You see what I'm saying? For that formula when you're doing your weighted system. Is that, you understand what I'm?
I think so, but if I'm not getting it, let me know. So I think, in a lot of states are moving towards trying to fund their districts and their charter schools through substantially the same formula, so that a student in a district school and a student in a charter school is essentially driving the same amount of funding and treating all public school students the same. But there are some differences. Some of those differences are, charter schools tend to have much more volatile enrollment. So they may be adding students mid-year, for example, and seeing a lot of students join in the middle of the school year. And so, in Texas, for example, sorry to keep going back to Texas, this is the one I know the best, but, they do an annual count for district schools in terms of enrollment. They readjust for charter schools every 6 weeks because that enrollment tends to move a lot, and those schools tend to be a bit smaller. So, there's things like that. In terms of the sort of relationship between the funding and the accountability, though, I don't see a tremendous amount of difference there, just linking those particular policy areas together. Charter schools are obviously held accountable by their authorizers in a much different way than school districts are held accountable by states through your state accountability system. But I do think, with a student-weighted funding formula, you still get that same conversation. You get that same direct link between how the funding is moving and what's happening in terms of student outcomes. So whether that conversation is happening at the authorizer level or it's happening through the state accountability system or some other process, it's still supporting that conversation, even if those funding streams are the same.
Just a quick follow-up. So do you still see the two flexibility in both for the policymakers? Do we still have the same flexibility to determine what those weights would be?
Oh, yes.
Both? Okay.
I mean, it's your school system, so you guys write the laws. But yes.
Any other questions, Senator Singleton?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for bringing this conversation today. And I'm very excited about this conversation because I represent one of these rural districts of poverty-based students that I think that are very much needed this weighted system, because the current system continue to have the educational gap continue to grow wider and wider in terms of students being left behind. And I'm glad that we're having this conversation. But outside of just throwing money into a system. Do you see in the systems that are out there, Mississippi, Texas, Kentucky, wherever, do you see a lot more dollars being spent on professional development to be able to get those weighted outcomes that they're looking for outside of just money?
I mean, in terms of how dollars are spent,
Yes.
I mean, the formula doesn't dictate that piece, but certainly state policy can. You have the opportunity to kind of direct funding towards, you know, professional development services if that's what you want. There's opportunities through your intervention system, through your ESSA plan, your federal accountability plan to do that kind of work. The flexibility doesn't eliminate the ability for the legislature to set priorities or to, direct money towards certain things or to incentivize districts to do certain things. And I think that's a lot of what you see in both Texas and Tennessee is really kind of an incentives-based system where there's a lot of technical assistance and direction coming from the State Department, not as a mandate, but really as more of a support system to, put best practices out so that districts have the opportunity to sort of pick up those best practices and implement them with technical assistance, with support. So there's some support in how do they use those dollars strategically. But, kind of as I was saying at the end, a big piece of this is really about implementation support and the shift if you're going to move from a resource-based formula to a student-weighted funding formula to really help local districts understand what's available to them now with this additional flexibility. How can they use dollars differently? How can they tie those dollars to evidence-based practices? And there's a real opportunity to provide that kind of support and information so that they can take full advantage of that.
Thank you.
I had a question too. Just I know we're talking just conceptually about a lot of different groups. One group I didn't see mentioned on the slides, but I think we've had in conversation were the gifted students. There's a justification for actually weighting systems with the high number of gifted students, and that's just I want to put that on the table because we're way behind as a state in terms of funding for that. I think we only now put about $10 million a year to gifted, and that's well below what surrounding states do. So just want to mention that. I think is that Senator Smitherman? Is that your man?
Yes, sir, Mr. Chairman, or Chairmans, I have to say it that way. Good morning, everyone. How do you, I'm going to say you all because you brought the presentation, so I'm saying it that way. And I don't think you all actually do all of it, but how do you all get the raw data? And in particular, I'll just talk in one area as it relates to special need kids. Because you are right, what you said is that it's a multitude of needs, and in order to provide those needs, you're going to have the necessary revenue. But in determining it, knowing what those districts are, and I'm gonna just say this, and you tell me what y'all do. I'm a raw data kind of guy. I'm not. I think that this weighted mean is a lot better than just put them in the bucket. But at the same time, I think it. I kind of for different reasons. Though I followed with some of my colleagues when they were talking about how you manipulate the system and how you're able to do that. We've dealt. I won't go into it, but we've dealt with one other aspect, dealing with trying to deal with something and dealing with weighted means, and it was manipulated. So I'm concerned about that. But on the front end, getting the data, so you will actually know what systems need. For instance, how many kids are on 504s, and what type of 504s they're on, those special needs categories. And how do you all get that? So that, because that's one of the things I think we're going to need, whether we're able to, and I'm going to say it in a relieving way to my colleagues, whether we're able to get 100% put every dollar that's needed. I think we need to know what those systems are, what the cost, how many, and those kind of things. So how did you all come up with that determination?
Well, I mean, we request data from states. The states collect a lot of data. Alabama collects a lot of data. So it's getting that enrollment data and those detailed data. Depending on what you all want to do, we're a little beholden to what the data are collected. So it may be, there may be things that can't be modeled at this point based on the data that's available. But the states have a multitude of data. They're required to collect a ton. Superintendent Mackey knows this all too well. And so, that's where it comes from, is from the state.
Mr. Chairman, just one other follow up. In those, uh, we've had some conversation here about accountability of results. In our particular situation, we have 206 schools who are failing. I, w- in an encountering that, uh, how is that brought into account of the fact that yes, more revenue will be going, but it's like filling a hole. That the field we gonna put in that hole is gonna half fill the hole for those schools, and the ones who are half filled, they'll come on up. But how, is there some kind of model that deals with those schools as well?
Well, I mean, you have an accountability system in the state, and that's certainly another policymaking option that can either be part of a funding conversation or separate from the funding conversation. And then I mentioned, what Tennessee has done is layered on that additional hearing process. That's one other option for, creating a different kind of conversation around accountability that's tied directly to how money is being allocated and is really linked to that funding bill. So, I think you have a lot of options in front of you for how you create that conversation and then what steps you want to take and sort of how many carrots and sticks you want to put in place for schools that are persistently underperforming.
Well, we have a small model, and I don't know necessarily that's what will take what we'll follow, but the governor did a good job in that herself in the program that she had. So I just want to put that out there that we do have a model. Thank you.
Representative Baker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Somewhat a simplistic question, but may have somewhat of a broad answer. And I think there's already maybe some um, mentioning, maybe at the forefront of this meeting, concerns, that is, with transition in states that have maybe had resource-based funding formula and then trying to shift to a student-weighted formula. I guess my question, very bluntly, is what were the obstacles or bigger obstacles in the various states that did transition from the resource-based funding to the student-weighted funding? I think we already recognize that shifting of funds is a concern, but can you elaborate more on that, the obstacles that would be faced in transitioning?
Yeah, I mean, I think, Tennessee is the most recent example. Mississippi just passed their bill, so they haven't really started implementing yet. And I think, some of the things to think about in the transition are, that technical assistance piece, which I talked about, and really kind of working with local school districts so they understand the flexibility that's available to them and understand how to kind of connect what they are now able to do that they weren't able to do before. I think there's other pieces to that as well as, kind of think about the technical implementation of the bill, and some of it ties to, questions about data. Do you have data systems that are robust enough to support this at the outset? And I think, as you ask yourselves those questions, you don't have to do everything all in one year. So, you can, set an agenda for policy change over time that enables you to sort of get systems and structures in place to support strong implementation. So it's not like you have to. Both Tennessee and Mississippi went all in. They went all in in 1 year, but a lot of states don't. They'll phase in a new policy over time, so they have an opportunity to get systems and structures and that technical assistance piece in place, so they can sort of hit the ground running with strong implementation as those new resources come online.
One sort of follow-up question. I recall that Mississippi had, and it wasn't across the board, but I guess it was maybe every 3 years, it was in one of the categories that they had that they would revisit and such. So I guess I like that component in there. I guess the revisiting part. Anything more you want to share in regards to that, in regards to as we look at this, for Alabama?
Yeah, I mean, it's tied to their base amount, so that foundational amount that's tied to every student. And they're looking at certain data elements every 3 years to kind of recalibrate. And what's nice about it is it's kind of defined some clear data elements that the legislature is looking at, whether it's, average teacher salary or, inflationary costs. I can't remember off the top of my head exactly what they're investigating, but it does set in statute kind of that formal review period so that they're then looking at their base objectively with data to understand whether it's still at the right level.
Representative Collins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. and you're pretty familiar with our system that we're using already, but I know ESSA requires us to track certain subgroups.
Mhm.
How many of these subgroups that we're talking about weighting are we already tracking? Do
You
know?
are already tracking all of the ones that we talked about today.
All of them. Okay.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Any other questions? All right, seeing none, I hope everyone enjoyed your lunch. Chairman Garrett, you got some parting wisdom for
Yeah,
us?
let's go back to the initial, how we started out, the initial basic assumptions, because I think we'll have some discussion among ourselves, but if we decide to move forward, the charge we've made to the groups that are advising us on this was, number one, that we want the funding to align with student needs. That would be one idea. All districts would see an increase in per pupil funding. School systems will receive more flexibility in allocating the funding they receive through the state's funding formula. Systems will retain control over local funding. Local dollars will not shift from one district to another. So as we look at this going forward, those are the ground rules. Any comments or questions from members? George? Yeah. There's no other questions. Thank you so much for the presentation. We stand adjourned.